All right, welcome to the possibly final edition of the McKeen's Hockey Podcast for the 2024 NHL Draft season. Today we're going to be discussing our final rankings. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the content in our draft guide. So we're just going to sort of hop right to it. The first thing we wanted to sort of discuss with obviously myself and Derek Neumeier is the top 10, right? It's the natural starting point for discussion. And one thing that has been highly debated among this draft class is the order of the numerous high-end defenders available. And we've kind of had Sam Dickinson as that top defender available all year, and we've kept it that way for our final rankings. And obviously with Dickinson being in my region for Ontario, I don't have an issue with that. I love Sam Dickinson. I've been on Team Dickinson all season long. So I think it's probably good to start with you, Derek, outside of the Ontario region. Why is Dickinson your number one defenseman available?
Yeah, it comes down to long-term potential. So right now, I think the argument could be made that as of today, Artyom Levshunov is a better defenseman. Maybe Anton Salayev is a better defenseman because, he's been playing in the KHL all season. But when I just look at Dickinson in comparison to the others, I can't shake the feeling that Dickinson is going to end up being the best one of the group eventually. He just has such a well-rounded toolkit with some tools that are, genuinely high-end, but genuinely elite. I mean, when you look at his skating ability, it's among the best in this entire draft class, forward or defenseman. He's very good at handling the puck, and he can do it at speed. He's an exceptional athlete. I mean, he had some of the best scores at the Combine a few weeks ago. He's a guy who can play offensively. He, scored at a point per game pace this season. He generated offense throughout the playoffs and at the Memorial Cup. He's a guy who has a ton of size and strength that he can use to defend at the NHL level eventually. And while there are some issues with him right now with regards to his decision making, sometimes his awareness, sometimes he can be a little lackadaisical in his own end, he's still a defenseman that brings so much, and you love the situation he's in with the London Knights. I mean, there's no organization in junior hockey that has a better track record of developing elite talent, including defensemen, as we've seen with Evan Bouchard as one example, Oliver Bonk, another one, Logan
Carlson.
Yeah, like the Knights are just they just know how to develop defensemen really, really well. So even though Dickinson, he might be a little raw right now in some areas, I really do have faith in the London system that they're going to not only maximize Dickinson's strengths as he develops there for the next 2 years, but also really work with him to minimize his weaknesses.
Yeah, and I think the big thing for me with Dickinson is I think the other guys all have some level of risk attached to them where perhaps they're not, number 2, number 3, number 1, number 4 defenders, not top 4 guys. I think there's a universe where Salayev is, just kind of a PK shutdown guy. I think there's a world where, Lev Shunov is more of like a power play quarterback. Same with Zane Parekh. There's a world where Carter Yakimchuk's decision making with the puck and skating, limits him to more of a depth role. Are those things likely? I would say no, but I think they're possible. Whereas with Dickinson, I just see such a safe player. As you said, he's just so well-rounded and the skating is so high-end that I just don't see him not developing into a top 4 defender who can play 20 minutes a night in virtually every situation. And I think that carries so much value when you're trying to pick in that top 6, top 7, top 8 range, and you're trying to find somebody who is going to be an anchor for your defense moving forward. And there's just such value in that, in my opinion.
And I think it also needs to be mentioned that I don't think Dickinson got as much love as he deserved this season for the success that he had. I mean, obviously, I was just talking about the long-term potential, but you look at what he accomplished this season. He scored a point per game pace. He was a top four defenseman playing a lot of minutes. He helped London win the OHL title. He helped them get very close to winning the Memorial Cup. And this is a guy that was playing big minutes for them. And he also wasn't playing on the top power play a lot of the time either. Like his offense was not coming from that top power play unit. There's been a lot of talk about the success that Salayev had in the KHL, Levshunov in the NCAA. Zeev Buium had a very, very successful season, won, World Juniors gold and an NCAA title. But Dickinson also accomplished a lot this season. He really did. And I don't think he's gotten as much attention as some of the other defensemen have. And I think that's kind of a shame.
Yeah, I agree completely. Okay, so another player that has been fairly highly debated in terms of where he should be ranked is Russian winger Ivan Demidov. And we've got him at number 2. And I think the reasoning from our perspective at McKeen's is that we believe Demidov has among the highest upside and highest ceiling of any player available in this draft. And that's why we have him at number 2. He was really good in the second half of the year. He is somebody that perhaps has the highest offensive ceiling of any player in this draft, perhaps even higher than Macklin Celebrini. Is he as likely to be an impact player as Celebrini? Absolutely not. Celebrini is locked in at number 1, and there's no question about that. But in our opinion, we just felt that Demidov was just a player that oozed offensive upside and potential. We're one of the few players in this draft class who could be that 80, 90 point guy on a consistent basis. And those are hard to find. And I know, Derek, you've kind of been a really big fan of his in the second half of the year.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of offensive upside to his game, like you were saying. He's incredible with the puck. He sees the offensive zone very, very well. He's got a lot of creativity. I think he's a very good shooter. People always talk about the hands and the playmaking because that stands out the most, but he's certainly no slouch when it comes to firing the puck as well. He's got a very good one-timer that he can get off from difficult angles and difficult body positioning. And something I think that I also really like about Demidov is he's actually pretty well-rounded, I find. Like every time I go to watch him, I'm expecting, the highlight reel plays, and those are usually there. But I also found myself becoming very, very impressed with his all-around game. He can be really, really heavy on the puck. He can protect it really well. He doesn't shy away from contact. He can fight through checks. I don't think he cheats at all defensively. More than anything, I think he's actually pretty committed defensively overall. When it came to the NHL playoffs this year, which Dickinson ended up being on the championship team. He helped SKA win the title. I thought he really upped his physical game and his compete level in the playoffs. Like when the chips were down, he was playing harder. He was playing more focused. He was playing faster, but the skill was still there. And I thought that was really, really impressive out of him. I thought it was a good sign for what he's going to be like in the NHL one day when it comes to a playoff series. Like this is a guy who can elevate his game. And this is a guy that is smart enough and is willing to work, as a 200-foot player. He's not, he's not going to be an next Patrice Bergeron or anything like that. But I don't think he's going to be a liability defensively. And I think he's going to be a guy who can create in transition, create off the rush, create off the power play, but also a guy who can, play a cycle game if he needs to. He can play in the dirty areas and win pucks in 50-50 battles and take them from the wall to the net. So you see the high-end ceiling with the skill, but I think he's also done a very good job at rounding out his game throughout this season.
Yeah, I agree. And I think he said all the right things at the recent Gold Star showcase as well, where he talked about, wanting to play in North America within the next couple of years. And this isn't a situation of, somebody who's going to marinate in the KHL for a long time. I think this is somebody who wants to come to North America within the next year or two, barring what happens contractually in Russia. But I just don't see the classic sort of Russian factor with this player. So I agree. And I think that's ultimately why we have him at number 2. So the next guy, I think we've got ranked a little bit higher than the consensus. Not significantly higher. He rose massively in the second half on virtually everybody's list. But that's Tisha Ginla, and we've got him ranked at number 5, fresh off of a really strong performance for Canada at the U18s and a really strong second half to the WHL season. I know, Derek, you're extremely familiar with Iginla. Why is he somebody that deserves to go in the top 5?
Yeah, like you were saying, he had a tremendous rise up draft boards this season, not just ours, kind of on everyone's. And there's a lot to like about him. The main thing being the goal scoring upside. Goals are always at a premium in the NHL level. And he can certainly fill the back of the net with ease, and he can score in a lot of different ways, which is very appealing. But the rest of his game is also very, very intriguing as well. He's a very good puck handler, a very good playmaker, maybe better than a lot of people realize, because his goals to assists numbers this year were a little bit skewed, but that's also because he played on a team that didn't have a lot of other finishers around him. So there are a lot of times where he kind of had to do things himself. But there's also a lot of character to his game. There's almost like this aura about Iginla that's really impressive. And that might sound a little weird, but let me try to quantify it. He just has this personality that is so built for NHL hockey. When the spotlight is on him, he plays better. When the pressure is high and the stakes are high, he plays better. And we saw that firsthand at the U18 tournament, like you were saying, where he helped Canada win gold. We saw that in the WHL playoffs, where he was one of the best players in the league in the first round. He was incredible for Kelowna. He almost like single-handedly carried that team. And, it's just, that's so rare. It's so rare to find a player who can handle the pressure and handle the expectations like that. Because at the NHL level, there is a lot of pressure. There's media scrutiny. There's, fan pressure. Like, it's not an easy gig. But Tej, being the son of Jerome Iginla, he's been around NHLers growing up. He's been in a lot of rinks. Like, this is kind of second nature to him in a way that I don't think it is for other players. And something else that I think is interesting about Iginla is that even though he played on the wing this year for almost the entirety of the season, aside from a few games at the start of the year, Kelowna has a pretty glaring need down the middle going forward. And he's a guy that has played center in the past, just not really this season. So there is talk that he might be tried down the middle in Kelowna the next 2 years. And I think he is someone who could really succeed as a center. And I think that would be something that obviously, bolsters his draft stock, because you've got a very, very well-rounded player with excellent hockey sense, excellent intangibles. If he's playing down the middle, that's just so much more value that you would get out of him picking him as high as the 5th pick.
Yeah, and I think something else worth mentioning is that he plays a very pro-style game, right? When you look at what has made the Florida Panthers so successful this year, right? On the verge of winning a Stanley Cup as we talk right now, they are so focused on getting pucks to the middle and so focused on getting pucks to the net and so middle lane driven, right? When you look at Iginla's game, I feel like he plays through the middle of the ice, maybe the best, other than maybe Macklin Celebrini, maybe the best of any forward in this draft class. And I think that's what makes him so attractive to NHL scouts, and what will make him so attractive to NHL scouts is the fact that, that is so translatable to being an impact player in the NHL, where, some of the other players play more of that junior style game that, is going to require a fairly lengthy transition period. Whereas with Tej Iginla, I don't see that. I think he's somebody who's going to transition very, very easily to being an impact player at the NHL level.
Yeah, absolutely. He already kind of plays and carries himself like an NHL player. So that gives him an advantage over a lot of the other guys at the top of this draft class.
Yeah, okay. So now moving into our top 20. Our top 20 is going to look different than everybody else's, and this is one of those draft years. One player that we have just outside of our top 10 is Zane Parekh, who is I'm not going to use the word polarizing, because I think everybody really likes Zane Parekh. It's just a matter of, how much hype he's getting within your particular scouting organization. So for us, we have some preferences with some of the other defenders available, but we still really like Zane Parekh. I think me personally, I think I just have some concerns about his ability to defend at the NHL level. I think that the will is there. I think that the sense is there. I think he's going to get better defensively, but is Zane Parekh ever going to be one of those guys who is a top pairing defender on a Stanley Cup team? Is his defense ever going to get to that point where, you know, you're asking him to play in all situations in a Stanley Cup final? I don't know. And I think that there's a little bit of risk attached to that. I think a guy like Zeke Williams defends better than Parekh currently. I think he's probably going to defend better than Parekh will at the NHL level. I think that he doesn't have those same sort of physical tools that a guy like Carter Yakimchuk has, or the aforementioned Dickinson and Salayev, right? So I think that's why, for me, he's just a little bit outside of that range. I expect Zane Parekh to be drafted inside the top 10. I think he's going to go higher than we have him. And I think he's going to be a very good offensive defender at the NHL level. He's just so creative. He's so skilled. He's one of the smartest on-puck players that I've seen come through the OHL in the last decade. And I think the accolades that he piled up this year speak volumes to that. It's more so, I do have some concerns about how he's going to defend at the pro level. And I know, Derek, you're kind of feeling the same way.
Yeah, there's a lot to like about Parekh, and I feel like in a lot of other draft years, he would kind of unanimously go a lot higher, maybe the 5th or 6th or 7th pick. It's not so much that he's bad that we have him where we do. It's more so that we like the guys ahead of him a little bit more. But yeah, what you were saying about the defending, it's a real concern. Because when you look at defensemen that you want on your top pair, you need guys who can play north of 20 minutes a night without getting in trouble. You know, that can be up to, 15 to 18 to 20 minutes at even strength. And when you're at even strength, you got to play offensively and you got to play defensively. And Parekh, there might be a bit of liability to him playing that many minutes. I mean, there's no doubt that he has first pair power play upside. I think he's going to be a fantastic power play quarterback at the NHL level, maybe one of the best in the league by the time he's fully developed, because he does have that level of talent and vision and creativity. But yeah, it's hard to put him any higher on our list, knowing that he might be a guy that you need to shelter a little bit, that you might need to rein in a little bit at even strength. Whereas some of the other defensemen on our list, you can play them more. There's more of a safety to them. They're more reliable. If Parekh scores 2 points in a game, that's great. But if he's responsible for 3 goals against, that's a huge concern. And you look at the size and the skating, and he's not small and he's not a bad skater, but neither of those traits are really high end. There's been comparisons of Parekh with someone like Erik Karlsson, and there are similarities. Karlsson's a guy who you live with the offense, you use him for the offense and you kind of live with the mistake defensively because he's so good offensively. But Karlsson at his prime was a fantastic skater, and Parech's not quite there, I would say. And I think that got Karlsson out of a lot of trouble, that Parech's not going to have that same kind of luxury. So, yeah, I do like him. I wouldn't be surprised at all if he went as high as 5 or 6 to a team that really wanted an offensive generator and power play quarterback. But I think the risks there are kind of undeniable.
All right, so we have a guy at number 12 that I think we have the highest of any of our competitors or any of the other amateur scouting organizations. And I know that when we had our draft meetings that we were discussing as a team, you were one of the really big champions of this player at number 12. I think it's only fitting that you sort of lead our talk about said player here.
Yeah, that player is Michael Hage of the Chicago Steel in the USHL. And this is a guy that I was very curious about coming into the season. I heard a lot of good things about him. He was highly considered, had a high pedigree, but didn't play a lot last year due to injury, and suffered a really, really big tragedy over the summer with the tragic passing of his father. And at the start of the year, Hage wasn't a true impact player for obvious reasons. He was shaking off some rust from the injury and the lack of games last year. He was undoubtedly going through a tough emotional period, But over the course of the season, you could sort of see him coming out of his shell a little bit more and a little bit more. And in the back half of the year, he took off. He was one of the best players in the league. He scored at well over a point per game pace on the steal, on an uncharacteristically bad steal team. Usually they're, among the best in the USHL. This year they weren't, but he really carried them to the playoffs in the back half of the season. He was just incredible. And when you look at the overall package that he brings, there's a lot to like. You've got a center who can play a bit of a physical power game, but he's also got a lot of skill. He's got great hands, great playmaking ability, great shot. He can beat defenders one-on-one, but he can also, work a power play and utilize his teammates well. I think he's got more athletic upside than we've necessarily seen so far. He seems like a guy who's going to keep, getting faster and getting stronger. And the fact that he's a center, that really can't be discounted. It's so hard to find really talented centers at the NHL level. And here's a guy who really grew into the role of a first line center on his team. And when I watch him, when you squint hard enough, I could foresee a future where Hage is a first line center on an NHL team one day. He's going to be going the college route. So he's going to get a little more time than the CHL guys to kind of refine his game and work on things. He kind of reminds me a little bit of Mark Scheifele, going back to Scheifele's draft, where Scheifele kind of came out of nowhere. He was a late riser and he got picked higher than a lot of people expected him to, but the Jets saw the long-term potential with him. They saw that he had a great blend of tools. They saw that his game was growing really quickly in the right direction. And in hindsight, that worked out to be a great pick for the Jets. They got a first-line center out of Mark Scheifele, a guy who can bring a bunch of different tools to the table. He can play the game in different ways. He's been very productive. And I think we're going to see a similar sort of career out of Hage. That's my prediction, and that's why I fought really hard to have him where we have him on our list.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head with mentioning the fact that he's a natural pivot. This draft class, as strong as it's sort of turned out to be, the one thing it is kind of lacking is that high-end natural pivot, right? And those are valued. And when you look at the kind of offensive upside that Hage has, that Mark Scheifele, that Jack Eichel upside at the very top end of his potential, to me, that's just too much to pass up, in the sandwich portion of the first round, where it's pretty rare to find a center who has that kind of upside, right? When you look at some of the other players in maybe not quite that range, but just outside of that range, you're looking at more of the middle six center types, right? You've got guys like Linus Eriksson. You've got guys like Cole Beaudoin. You've got guys like Sam O'Reilly out of London. You have guys who fit that sort of mold as opposed to, that really impactful offensive player mold that Hage could be. Yeah, the consistency, wasn't always there this year in the USHL, but I think, like you said, Chicago just wasn't very good. So yeah, there are going to be times where he's struggling, and I don't think you can necessarily completely put that all on him. And I think a lot of the concerns that people have sort of are around the lack of compete and the inconsistency. But I would argue that if he was surrounded by, more talent, like a typical Chicago Steel team of the last half a decade, we might be talking about everybody having Hage in this sort of 10 to 14 range. So, we really like his upside. We really like the fact that he's a natural center in a draft that doesn't have too many high-end natural centers. But that brings us to another player who has slid down our list all the way to number 15th. And that is Cole Eiserman of the U.S. under-18 team. And I guess the big concern that Derek and I both have, we've talked about this at length. We talked about this a lot in our meetings for our final rankings. We just worry that Eiserman is somebody who has plateaued, somebody that was really good at a younger age, really good last year, still good this year, no question about it. You don't do the things that he did this year in terms of breaking some records at the program without being a quality prospect and a quality player. But at the same time, can you really argue that Cole Eiserman was a better player this year compared to last year? I don't necessarily know if you can. And one thing that we always look for at McKeen's, it's something that our scouting group, feels very strongly about, is players who continue to get better and continue to show progression positively, because that points to players who are willing to put in that work and willing to get better and have the natural gifts to get better and are going to continue to improve to make the National Hockey League. The guys who tend to, I'm not going to use the word bust, but the guys who tend to, disappoint in comparison to their draft slot are those guys who do plateau at a younger age and kind of max out what they're capable of doing. And with Eiserman, that's kind of our worry, especially when you look at the fact that the biggest weaknesses for him are off the puck. So, if other components of his game have sort of maxed out, he's not a huge guy. We're not talking about, a 6'3" or 6'4" goal scorer. We're talking about, an average size goal scorer who, yes, is an elite goal scorer, but the size is only average. The skating is only average. The off-puck play is a concern. Really, you're just drafting him for that goal-scoring ability. And there's been other guys who've come through that program, like your Oliver Wahlstrom, like your Kiefer Bellows. You've had guys come through the OHL that have been like that, like Michael Del Cole. These guys, they've struggled to make that next step to being NHL players. And ultimately, that is our fear with Eiserman.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said there. And it's so important to be able to adapt your game, because that's just the way it works in the hockey world, right? You go from junior to college or to, the AHL level, or you go from the junior league in Europe to the pro league and then eventually to the NHL. You have to be able to adapt and evolve your game when you move up levels. And you look for players who have shown the ability to adapt and evolve and learn when necessary. And we haven't really seen that with Eiserman. And as good as the goal scoring is, and that's really the reason why he is still this high, is because he is an exceptional goal scorer, and teams always need guys who can score the way he can. It's hard to see the value there if he doesn't make significant improvement elsewhere to his game. Because right now, he's not a guy who can really drive play on his stick. He doesn't provide a lot of value defensively or just in general off the puck. And it's hard to put a guy like that on your first line when you kind of need others to create for him. On the top power play, sure. Set him up somewhere where he's got a little bit of space, surround him with good playmakers who can feed him the puck. He'll score, no doubt about it. But it's hard to be a guy who needs that kind of assistance at even strength. And I will say that he did make some progress this year. I think he knew and was probably told that he needed to round out his game and refine some things. And there was some progress there, but not as much as I would have liked to see. He's a guy that, if you were to rate his shooting ability, it could be like a 9 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10. But nothing else about his game, I'd say, is over a 6 or a 7, which is concerning. And yeah, the comparisons with Wahlstrom and Bellows, it's not apples to apples, but you worry about that, right? Because those guys scored a lot in a very favorable situation, surrounded by talented players at the program. Eiserman's there too, but those guys, once they got to the NHL, they weren't surrounded by elite talent all the time. They had to do a little bit more of that work themselves, and they struggled to do it. So I worry about that with Eiserman as well. Not enough that, I don't think he should go in the first round or anything, but I think teams need to be very careful when picking him. I think it should be a team that already has some other young, talented forwards that would pair well with him. Because if you're drafting him to be a guy who plays on your first line and leads that line, I think you're taking a lot of risk.
And yeah, I think he's going to be a guy that probably profiles as the type that needs a high-end playmaker to play with him. So I think you're right. I think team fit is going to be really, really important for Eiserman, for his future success. And I think the team that drafts him needs to be very cognizant of that. At 19, we have a player who is going to be very interesting for Derek and I to discuss, because I would say that Derek and I are probably a little bit lower on him in comparison to the rest of our team. And the reason that this player was 19th is pretty much everybody else on the McKeen's scouting team absolutely loves this player. And, we are, at the end of the day, a scouting team, and all opinions need to be voiced and heard and equally represented. And our team absolutely loves Alphonse Fry. Derek and I like him. I know Derek is going to talk about, some of the reasons why he has some concerns, and I'm going to as well. I love the offensive upside of Fry. I think he was a really strong international performer this year. I thought he was really good at the World Junior A Challenge. Thought he was good at the U18s. Thought he was good at the Nations tournaments. I do love the skating. I think that's extremely high end. I think this is a player who has some good offensive upside. I worry a little bit about the decision making and the overall IQ. I worry about his ability to defend. But I saw enough in him, enough flashes of that to justify this ranking. And that's why ultimately I was okay, putting him inside our top 20. Even though I'm not sure he goes as high at the NHL level, I think this is a player that is somebody that we have higher ranked than NHL scouts do. And that's something we're going to get into in a little bit later on in the podcast. But Derek, why were you okay with Fry at 19, but also somewhat, weary of him being that high?
Yeah, it took me a while to kind of come around to him. And I will say that he did grow on me a lot as the season progressed, because you see flashes of it with him. There are times where he'll flash some really high-end skating ability, some really high-end puck skill, and he'll blend those two together to make some really impressive plays. There are times where he is very dangerous from the offensive blue line or very dangerous in transition, and that's great. I think that's enough to put him in the consideration for the first round, because he doesn't have a red flag with his defending or with his size or his physicality or anything like that, although those things aren't necessarily strengths. But for me, I just had a lot of very mixed viewings of him this year. There were times where I watched him where I just really didn't see much of an impact. You look at his scoring totals from this season and they're okay, but 33 points in 40 games, that's not bad, but that's not great. That's not what you would usually kind of expect out of a Swedish defenseman being considered as a first round talent. And it makes me wonder, where's the disconnect? Is this a guy who has good tools, but sometimes struggles with understanding how to use them? When I've watched him play on the power play, I've thought there have been times where he's been good, but I don't know if he naturally thinks the game or sees the offensive zone well enough to be a real power play quarterback or even much of a second pairing guy. And I think that kind of makes me wonder a little bit about his long-term upside. Like, what's he going to be in the NHL? Is he a top pair defenseman? Probably not. Is he a second pair guy who transitions the puck well? For sure. Yeah, I can certainly see that. But if he's a guy who plays on your second pairing, but maybe doesn't get on your second power play unit, I don't think he's great enough defensively to be a real go-to guy on the penalty kill. So, how many minutes is he going to play in the NHL? What's his role going to be? If he's just going to be playing 15 or 16 minutes a night, that's great. I mean, if you can draft a player who plays in your second pair and gives you those minutes consistently and drives possession positively, that's a win. But how high do you draft a player like that? There have been times where I've seen those flashes of the high-end upside. It makes me think maybe he could be a power play guy or maybe a number 2 or a number 3 on a team. But they just haven't been consistent enough for me to feel necessarily comfortable putting him any higher than we currently have him.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things, too, is as much as I like Fry, I ask myself sort of what separates him from some of the other similar kind of defenders from other regions. What separates Fry from Cole Hudson? What separates Fry from Terrence Smith in the WHL, a player who, is equally raw in terms of the process and the application of his skill set, but ultimately does have upside? What separates Fry from a guy like Henry Muse of the Ottawa 67s, right? I think that's sort of where I had problems with where I wanted Fry to be ranked. But as I said, our team absolutely loves him. So if you want to know more about Fry and you want to know why, hit up the rest of the members of our team on social media, and they'll be happy to answer more questions about him. Bringing it to somebody that I absolutely champion for at 20th in our rankings is EJ Emery. And this is one of my favorite players in this entire draft class. And I just recently released a pretty lengthy scouting report on McKeensHockey.com of Emery and why I really like him. And I just see a player who not only oozes athletic potential and athletic upside, but has shown that growth, sort of the anti-Cole Eiserman, if you will, who was so much better in the second half on that program in pretty much every single way. And I think that there is even a little bit more offensive upside than people realize. I think this is a player who's still learning how to use his mobility gifts, his strong skating ability to impact the game offensively. He's never going to be a high skill guy, but when you look at the way that a guy like Sam Dickinson uses his skating ability off the puck, I think that's something that Emery could do. And I think that towards the end of the year, we really started to see that. He wasn't burying his chances. The shot needs to improve 100%. But he was getting chances. The U18s, he had a couple breakaways. This is a guy that I think just has more upside than your standard shutdown defender. And even then, at the bare minimum, if he is, a Brandon Carlo type, that's well worth the 20th overall pick, in my opinion.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, we were talking about Perek earlier, and, the offense is so good that you don't mind the defense to a certain degree. Emery, it's the opposite. The defense is so good, and the defensive upside is so good that, even though he didn't score a goal at all this year, barely put up any assists, that doesn't really bother me, because this is a guy who has every kind of tool that you want in a shutdown defenseman at the NHL level. The size, the athleticism, the reach, the skating ability, it's all there. I think he understands the defensive side of the game very, very well as well. You look at what it takes to be a high-end defenseman at the NHL level. Now, you got to be able to defend against players with size and strength. You also have to be able to defend the rush against the likes of your, Connor McDavids and your Nathan McKinnons. And Emery is a guy who can do that. I mean, I see a future where this guy is a number 2 on a top pair of a team. You've got a guy on his left who can carry the puck and handle breakouts and stuff like that, whereas Emery is the guy who handles the shutdown responsibilities. And with that athleticism, this is a guy who can play a lot of minutes and doesn't look like he gets tired. It's so hard in the NHL, especially in the playoffs, to play 20 minutes a night over and over and over again, to keep up a high pace throughout a game as you get to the third period into overtime. That takes a lot of athleticism and conditioning, and Emery certainly has that. And I like that you touched on the budding offense, because I think it's there as well. I mean, this is a guy who has tools that can translate into offensive success. The skating is one thing. I think he's actually pretty good with the puck. He's not a dangler. He's not a playmaker. But I don't think he has stone hands the way that a lot of shutdown defensemen do. And maybe he just hasn't had the right opportunity to kind of grow the offensive side of his game. Maybe he hasn't had the right encouragement. But when I watch him play, I keep coming back and wondering, why isn't he scoring more? Because he certainly has the ability to do it. And I think that once he gets a little more comfortable, maybe once he feels like he's really kind of hit a limit at a certain point in his development on the defensive side of things, maybe he will start to feel a little more curiosity to take more risks offensively, or maybe the team that drafts him wants to spend more time to help him round out his game through their development system. So yeah, he's grown so much in terms of skill and impact throughout the season. I thought he was the best defenseman for the Americans at the U18s, and he had 6 points in 7 games there. So we saw those flashes of the offense coming alive. So yeah, I really, really like him. I wouldn't be surprised to see him go a lot higher because this is a guy with an incredibly high floor, but also, there's some potential for a high-end upside that we haven't quite fully seen yet.
Okay, so discussing some of the other players in our first round, as we move further down our list, one name that jumps out is Stein Solberg, our Norwegian defender who rocketed up our list, rocketed up everybody's list with his play in the second half, with his play at the World Championships. He moved all the way up to 23rd in our list. I guess the question that I have for you, Derek, and it's a question that I've been asked a few times in reference to our list is, why isn't he higher?
Well, for me, it comes down to the upside. So in the back half of the season, he certainly rose up our lists because of his strong play, not just at the Worlds, where he was playing up against NHL talent, against guys who've been playing pro for a long time in Europe. He was also really good in the Norwegian League playoffs. Now, that's not necessarily a high-end league, not to the same degree as the Liga in Finland or the KHL in Russia or the SHL in Sweden, but it's still, professional league. And he was great. He was one of the best defensemen on his team. He's one of the best defensemen in the playoffs in that league. And he had a real impact. He was driving play. He was becoming a major difference maker. And, that there's a lot to like about him. He's very physical. He's a good skater. He's getting a lot better with his puck movement and his offensive awareness. I've seen him from the start of the year to later on. I actually went back and watched a lot of video of him just to see the growth. He was getting a lot more comfortable at taking chances, and he was also getting a lot better at finding spots to create offense. For me, why we don't have him higher than where he is, I do wonder a little bit about the long-term upside. I think he's a guy who projects very well to the NHL because he has a very pro style already, and we've seen him against NHL competition, and he's held his own despite being a teenager. But I just don't know if there's a huge upside to his game. I don't think he's going to be much of an offensive generator. I think he'll be a good defender, but he doesn't have some of the same appealing tools defensively that like a Salayev has with the size and the reach and the skating, or Emery, like we were just talking about, with the crazy athleticism. I think Solberg's good. I think he's going to be a very good, very hard defender at the NHL level. But for me, I think the ceiling is more of a second pairing guy, probably a number 4, but maybe a guy who is one of your go-to penalty killers. He certainly seems like he's going to be a very, very good penalty killer at the NHL level. And I think that's enough for him to get picked in the first round. I think a team's going to be very happy to pick him in the first, somewhere in the 20s, because they know they're getting a guy who's going to be on their team pretty likely, and someone who will probably be popular amongst the fans and in the locker room. But there are just other players that I would rather pick before him, because maybe those guys can be first line forwards or top pair defensemen.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned upside in comparison to some of the other defenders in this range, because the next one I wanted to talk about was Harrison Brunick, who I know you're surely familiar with, and you're one of the reasons why he was ranked 22, just a spot ahead of Solberg. So if we're comparing the two, why Brunick over Solberg? Is it just the offensive upside, the perception that his offensive upside is just that little bit higher?
Yeah, I think so. And not just the offense, but I think the all-around upside is better with him. I think Solberg will be a bit better as a true shutdown guy, but with Brunick, I think there's just a lot of untapped potential there. So he's a guy who played on the Kamloops Blazers last year on the Memorial Cup hosts, and they had a stacked team with the likes of Logan Stankoven, Olin Zellweger, Fraser Minton, and you can see that Brunick really picked up a lot of tips and tricks from those guys, because this year his game took a really, really big step forward. And in a weird way, he's in a really good situation on a rebuilding Kamloops team, because they don't have a lot of depth. They don't have a lot of talent. So he's getting a lot of opportunity. He played a ton of minutes this year, and his minutes kept going up and up throughout the season. He emerged as their number 1 defenseman, and we saw his game grow in all areas. He's being more physical down low. He's winning a lot more battles, but he was also being more confident in the rush. He was taking more offensive chances. He was, activating a little bit more from the offensive blue line. And his game was just moving in such a good direction at such a good trajectory until he got hurt. Unfortunately, missed a bunch of time. But when he came back for the U18s with Canada, they put him in more of a shutdown, penalty killing role. And I thought he actually looked really good there as well. At first, I wasn't thrilled with how they were using him. I didn't think it was necessarily the best usage of his skill, but he really leaned into that role. And by the end of the tournament, he was playing it very, very well, which turned out to be great for me to see as a scout, because it made me realize this guy can be potentially a really good shutdown defenseman as well. And you just look at the trajectory and his pathway moving forward. I mean, he's going to be the number one defenseman for Kamloops for the next 2 years. He's going to be playing north of 25 minutes a night. He's going to be getting reps on the power play. He's going to be getting reps on the penalty kill. I just think his development is in a really great environment to kind of take off. And when you've got a guy who, can prove himself as a number one defenseman and be comfortable in that role, it makes you wonder, what's stopping him from maybe working his way up to the AHL and becoming a number one defenseman there, and then maybe working his way up to a top pairing guy at the NHL level one day. I mean, obviously that's, a long way off, and that's a lot of things would have to go right between now and then. But when I watch Brunick and I see the progress that he made, and I see, the situation he's in to keep progressing, I don't think that's too far of a stretch. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility. Whereas with some other defensemen out there, maybe I feel more comfortable as them as like a higher floor, lower ceiling kind of guy. But with Brunick, I think there is a lot of potential there. And as a right shot defenseman who can skate, who's 6'3", those always have a lot of value too.
Yeah, I kind of look at him as a bit of a blank canvas. And I think that's what makes him so intriguing is there are these really interesting physical tools. And on every night, per se, he looks a little bit different. And how he utilizes those tools is a little bit different. And, seeing him in that sort of shutdown PK role for Canada at the U18s was very interesting. Whereas I felt like just before he got injured towards the end of the WHL season, we started to see him blossom as a transporter and more of an offensively oriented defender. And, what is the real Brunick look like? I don't think we know, but I think that is really intriguing. I think he's the kind of guy that a team with a really good development program is going to get their hands on. They're going to really mold him into a quality NHL player. And I think that's why we've got him ranked so high. Another guy from the WHL that has moved up our rankings and into our first round is somebody who, you and I have chatted about a lot this year. And I remember you talking about him at different points of the year, and it's been a bit of a roller coaster, because I remember talking to you about him at the beginning of the year and you saying, well, I just don't think this guy's very good. And then I feel like your opinion just slowly started to evolve to the point where, you really kind of liked him at the end of the year. And then that's Julius Mietin.
Yeah, absolutely. Mietin certainly won me over. And it's funny because I've talked about him with other scouts, including a couple scouts in the NHL. And we've all kind of had the same sort of, a feeling about it, the same sort of path to where we are with him now, where at the start of the year, he wasn't bad per se, but he wasn't truly great. He's a guy who was really good down low. He was, playing on the power play a lot. He was good at winning battles along the boards and making good plays and tight around the net. And, as a big center from Finland playing his first year in the WHL, you could tell that he was still working through some things, but there were tools there. There were things to work with. And, I took a bit of a break from him. I hadn't seen him in a while. And then the CHL NHL Top Prospects game rolls around. And I see that Mietin had one of the best scores. I think it was the best score in one of the skating drills. And I'm like, well, that can't be right. That has to be some kind of mistake. When I watched him before, he wasn't a great skater. He didn't play at a lot of pace. Like that, something must be wrong here. But when I went back to watch some more recent games of his, I discovered that something had changed, where he had really learned what it kind of took to be successful at this level. And in reading some articles about him, it was some interviews that were done with him, that was certainly the case, where at the start of the year, he didn't really understand, the pace of the league and, how hard he needed to skate every shift, the kind of work he needed to do with his conditioning and his mobility. But at a certain point, he really started to lean in on that. And the results since then have been magnificent. Like, this is a guy who now skates very, very well. He managed to flip his skating from a weakness to a strength, and his game has really taken off from there. At the start of the year, he wasn't scoring a lot. He wasn't producing. But in the back half of the year, he turned into a very good offensive generator for the Everett Silvertips. Finished the year just a hair above a point per game player. So he's a guy who's going in the right direction with his development. And like we were talking about before with Yzerman, I really like that Miettinen has shown the ability to adapt his game and evolve it. And when you look at the overall package right now, you've got a big center who's good with the puck, who's a good skater, who has some good offensive chops. He hasn't really played a lot in defensive situations this year. Everett didn't use him very much on the penalty kill or in a lot of defensive situations, but he certainly has the tools to be that kind of player. So when I look at the overall projection with him, I see a guy that could become, a middle six center who can play both sides of special teams, who can, create offense in the rush, who can create offense in the cycle, who can get pucks from the wall to the net. And that's pretty impressive. Like, that's the type of player that usually gets picked in the late first, in the early second. And I think it also needs to be said that Everett has a really good system. They develop prospects very well, better than a lot of other junior leagues out there. So I think his development's in really good hands. He was a top 6 forward for them this year, so he's going to get a lot of minutes in the next couple of seasons. So yeah, I like the progress that he made this year. And I think he's going to be a player who continues to make a lot of progress moving forward. Maybe at the NHL level, he doesn't quite hit his ceiling. He becomes more of a bottom 6 guy. But you can get a really solid third line center in the first round. That's not necessarily a bad value pick.
And I think you kind of hit the nail on the head by saying center, right? We just talked about how this isn't a outstanding draft for centers, and the fact that Miettinen is a natural center who's somebody who projects to stay down the middle at the next level. I think that gives him a little bit of added value. And yes, there are quite a few in this range that are similar players to Miettinen. But at the same time, this is a guy that I think can bring a lot of value in a team's middle six, like you said. Next, we want to talk about just some guys that outside of our first round, obviously, that were movers and shakers. They were guys that moved up or down our rankings fairly significantly compared to our midterm ranking. And the first guy is Cole Hudson. And I think this is just because he was able to actually play, right? Cole Hudson missed a lot of time through the middle part and towards the end part of the NDTP season. Returned for the U18s and was one of the better defenders in that tournament. And I think what impressed me most with Hudson at the U18s specifically was his defensive play. He wasn't a liability at all. And I think that was something that I was really looking for was, is this a guy that can defend? Because he's not big, and he's not as, I would say, dynamic offensively as his brother is. So, what's the likelihood that, Cole is going to be a top 4 defender at the NHL level? Can he round out his game and be more of, a two-way puck moving type? Sort of that like Matt Grzelcyk kind of role, right? That has played for Boston. And, I think that the return that he had at the U18s after that long layoff was really impressive. And I think he deserved to move up into the range that we have him. I think he represents or would represent a really solid, early to mid second round pick for an NHL organization.
Yeah, I agree. He kind of strikes me as like a perfect pick in the 30s, like one of those guys that I don't know if I'd want to take him in the first round, but early on day 2, absolutely. I like Hudson. I like what he brings. I think some traits of his are very good. I think he's a very good puck handler, a very good skater. I think he's got very good hockey sense. I don't know if there's anything necessarily elite about his game. With Lane, his brother, I thought his skating and his hockey sense and his drive were very, very high end. Whereas with Hudson, it's more so that I think he's more well-rounded than Lane, but lacks maybe some true standout traits. When I try to project him, I see a guy who I think he could be a second pair defenseman and a second unit power play guy, and that's pretty good. If you can get that in early second round, he's a guy who ends up maybe being like a 40-point player for you. I think that's pretty good value. And yeah, I think there's like a certain amount of safety to him, which you don't always say about defensemen who are undersized and maybe don't have the best physical tools. But I do feel very confident in Hudson's ability to make the NHL and to be a secondary offensive driver and puck transporter from the back end.
You have two other guys that moved up pretty considerably are in my region in Ontario, and that's Cole Beaudoin and Ben Danford. And both of these guys, I just released fairly lengthy scouting reports on McKeensHockey.com as well. Lots of video content on both of these guys. I'll let you sort of speak to Beaudoin because I know you're a really big Cole Beaudoin fan. So I'll speak to Ben Danford. I just think that this is somebody who I said on social media earlier today that I felt a lot of the amateur scouting community sort of wrote him off at the beginning of the year because he struggled a little bit with the puck. They kind of already had made up their mind that, yeah, okay, this guy, is sort of a defensive first guy who can skate a little bit, but the offensive upside is 0 to none. So they kind of wrote him off as one of those mid-round pick kind of guys. And I didn't see a lot of movement within certain parts of the amateur scouting community for Danford, even though I think if you were to actually, and that's not to say that people weren't watching Ben Danford, I just don't know if they were really watching him that intently or that closely because there was already this preconceived notion about him lacking any sort of offensive upside. And I think if you really focused in the second half, Danford's play with the puck, Danford's ability to use his speed without the puck really improved. His confidence as an offensive player took off in this year's OHL playoffs. He was one of the better defenders in the OHL playoffs for Oshawa, helping them reach the final in the OHL, losing to London. This is a guy that brought home a few parts of the OHL coaches poll. He was named the Eastern Conference's best defensive defender. He was named one of the hardest workers, one of the best shot blockers. This is somebody who's highly regarded by coaches. And that's going to carry over to being highly regarded by NHL scouts. It's going to carry over to being highly regarded by future pro coaches. This guy is just a gamer. He is just competitive. And I think that when you look at the fact that he is a defensive guy that is a good skater, but also is starting to flash some of that two-way upside. I think that is incredibly interesting and alluring. And I think that at the worst case scenario, you got a guy that's going to play, on your third pairing and kill penalties and be a really good, 30 to 60 pick wherever he ends up going. I think, like you said earlier, if you can get somebody who can play that kind of role, a key role on your team, being more than just, AAA depth, that's important. And I think Danford at the very minimum is that. But at the high end, I think that his offensive game can continue to evolve to the point, where we're talking about him as, a solid number 4, as somebody that can play pretty key minutes for your team. And I really, really like this player. What do you talk about Cole Beaudoin?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the things that you were saying about Danford are going to carry over to Beaudoin. And something that I think needs to be said about both of them is that when it comes to the public-facing amateur scouting community and just hockey fans in general, fans who follow the draft, it's understandable that there's a draw to the players that are flashy and sexy and exciting. The guys who have, dynamic puck skill and produce a lot of points. And that's great. I mean, those players are going to find their way to the NHL too, but you can't downplay the guys who project really well in some of the dirtier areas or some of the or the guys who can do more of the hard work to get there. Because there are a lot of guys in the NHL, your Jordan Martinuks or your Radek Foxes or what have you. These guys that are just, they go out there and they grind and they work, but there's value to that. These are guys that make a difference. They can shut down the guys in the other team. They can kill penalties. And come playoffs every year, we see it every year that these guys have outsized value when the refs put away the whistles a little bit and everyone has to dig in a little bit more. And with Baudouin, I see a guy who has a lot of NHL upside. Do I see it as a first liner? No, I don't. Do I see it as a second liner? Maybe, but probably not. But I see a guy who's going to be an excellent third line center, maybe to the level of someone like a Jordan Staal, who played as a third line center on those Penguins teams behind Crosby and Malkin and helped them win a cup. That's kind of the ceiling that I see for him, where, if he has offensive guys down the middle on his organization who can handle some of the offensive output, you let Cole Baudouin handle some of the dirty work, some of the matchups, the key face-offs, the penalty killing. And he just projects so well in that role. He's big, he's strong, he's smart. He's got that grit and tenacity to him. His skating is a work in progress, but it is progressing. I don't think it's bad to the point where it'll prevent him from being a successful NHLer. And I think he just understands really well what his strengths are and how to maximize them. He's not a guy who's going to go out there and try to be a dangler and try to be something that he's not. I think he really leans into his strengths and his identity. And it's actually really funny. I think it was at the Combine where someone asked him for an NHL comparable or a player that he models his game after. He said Boone Jenner, which was perfect. I mean, that's the exact answer that I would have wanted to hear out of him, because Boone Jenner's a good NHLer. Not a superstar by any means, but he's a guy who's played a lot and holds a lot of value. And when you look back at where Columbus got him, which I think was in the second round or the third round, that's a great value pick. He's been a huge hit for them. Wears a letter on his sweater. Like, that was a great win. When I look at Baudouin, I see a similar sort of career for him where, I think there's a lot of NHL upside, and I think he's going to be a guy who plays and probably has a long career. And I think he'll be someone that's always appreciated by his NHL team and by his coaches, even if he's not someone who scores a lot of points.
All right, so that brings us to one of our larger fallers. I think probably fitting if we use the word enigma for this player, and that's because I think with even within your Western region scouting community, within our Western region scouting community with you and Adam and Ben, there wasn't even a consensus on this player, and that's Adam Yeko of Edmonton. And he was just, in my opinion, not being within your region, a very hard player to scout because he was just so wildly inconsistent.
Yeah, he's someone that I became very interested in early on in the season. And he's a guy that we had higher earlier on our list because he flashed a lot of offensive upside and a lot of overall upside. You've got a 6'5" guy who is playing in his first year in North America. He's a center. He can skate pretty well at times. He can handle the puck pretty well at times, although pretty poorly at other times. He has a great shot when he wants to use it. When you look at all the tools there, it's a very appealing overall package. But what kept happening throughout the season was that there were just so many stretches where you just didn't notice him. You'd have like a moment in a game where he'd do something incredible and, pull you to the edge of your seat as a scout. And you'd go, this is great. He's finally starting to figure it out. And then he'd go a few more shifts, maybe even a few more whole games where he doesn't really do anything like that again. And I think enigma is kind of the right word for him, because sometimes he looks incredible and looks like he could have been a first round talent in this draft. And then sometimes he doesn't look like a guy who should be drafted at all. I mean, if you took a scout and only gave him one chance to watch Yeko throughout the season, you could get two very, very different opinions about what this player could be. Now, at the end of the day, you have to bet on tools to a certain degree, and Yeko certainly has a lot. The Oil Kings weren't great this year. They were a very, very bad team. They really struggled. There were a lot of games where they were out of the game, within the first few minutes or the first period, and maybe that had a negative effect. But he's a guy that I think with the right development in the right NHL team's hands, I think you can work with him. I think you can teach him to maximize his tools to the level where we can see him use them more often. I think you can work with him to improve some of the weaknesses in his game. I think there's a lot to work with here, but he's just kind of like a big, raw lump of hockey player clay where you can, mold him into something that's impressive. It's just going to take a lot of time. And there is a risk that maybe he just doesn't quite figure it all out. But that's kind of why we have him where we do, where there's just less certainty that we're going to see the best version of himself. And maybe we have to settle for something much less.
Speaking of risk, another player that fell pretty significantly is Aaron Kiviharju. And I think some of that was not really his fault, just the injury that he picked up this year and not being able to play the good chunk of the season and then returning for the U18s, clearly quite rusty. But on the other hand, if we're comparing him to a guy like Cole Hudson, who, did miss a good chunk of the year to injury as well, returned to the U18s and was really, really good. I would say Kiviharju returned to the U18s. The expectations were really high, and he wasn't even the best defender on his team. And I think that sort of concerned us a little bit. And earlier we talked about plateauing with Cole Yzerman, and you kind of get the sense that Kiviharju, who used to be a potential top 5 pick in this draft class, 2 years ago, maybe he's also sort of hit that wall, that plateau. And, now it's about trying to get over that hump and trying to improve as a player and trying to figure out, what kind of player, he's going to be. Obviously, offensively, he's probably going to, the offensive part of his game is going to be his calling card, and power play quarterback is probably what you want him to develop into. But at the end of the day, the production just wasn't good enough at the U18s in comparison to some of the other players even on his team or other players at that tournament who really stepped up. And I think that's why we moved him down our list. We just felt like there were other players who really stepped up. And it's unfortunate with his injury, but at the end of the day, you compare him to a guy like Adam Jiricek, who we still kept quite high, despite also missing the vast majority of the season. But, the physical tools are just so much better there with Jiricek. There's a fallback there where if the offensive game doesn't really develop, he still has the size and the mobility and the defensive acumen to be an NHL player, where with Kiviharju, there's that risk that, he isn't an NHL player at all in any capacity. And that's scary. I think that even us having him ranked 63rd, it felt like maybe even that was just based on previous hype, and we were sort of falling into that trap. But on the other hand, it felt wrong to rank him any lower than that.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said. And for me with Kiviharju, it's just, I have a hard time seeing what he's going to be at the NHL level and what kind of value he's going to bring. There just aren't a lot of defensemen like him at the sport's highest level, and that's obviously concerning. He's not a big defenseman. He's pretty undersized, and he's a good skater, but he's not a really high-end skater, the same way that someone like a Quinn Hughes is, where the skating makes up for the lack of size. And I think he's good with the puck. I think he's good offensively. I think he's, good at digging in and defending hard, but he's not great really at any of those other things. And I don't know. I have a hard time seeing why an NHL coach would give him a lot of minutes. Sometimes I have a hard time seeing why an NHL GM would want to call him up from an AHL team onto an NHL team over some guys who maybe project a little bit safer as a power play option or as a penalty killer. I just see a guy who doesn't have a ton of real NHL upside or a really clear ability to fill a role. We were talking about the likes of someone like Emery, where even though he's not scoring, you see the role he would fill. He's a guy who could defend the rush at even strength and a guy who can kill penalties. With Kiviharju, what does he do at the NHL level that's going to win him a job over other players? And you'll get the other defensemen in this draft, defensemen around him in this range, like Terrence Smith, who we talked about, who's a better skater and a better puck handler, or someone like Tomas Galvas out of Czechia, who's also a better skater and a better puck handler. Like those guys I could see being puck transporters and breakout options at the NHL level, or maybe secondary power play guys. With Kiviharju, I don't know. There's just a lot of uncertainty there that I have a hard time reconciling.
Okay, so we're at the point of our podcast now. We're going to start to do a bit more rapid fire type segments. And one of the first ones that Derek and I are going to talk about is this year's surprise first rounder. There's always somebody that for the amateur NHL fan, in terms of how much they pay attention to the NHL draft, is a huge surprise, right? Last year it was Easton Cowan. We've had many in previous years. I feel like this year, though, the group that's ranked within, like, let's say 20 all the way to like 75, I don't know if there's anybody that would be like, oh man, that was shocking. Like, there are so many similarly ranked players. There are so many players' rankings all over the place, all over the map this year, depending on who you ask, that I think there's going to be quite a few players who are somewhat shocking, but not really shocking, if that makes any sort of sense to those listening. But I know that's a bit of a cop-out, so we're still going to give you some answers. But I do feel like this draft class is so wide open, especially when we get to, the last 7 or 8 picks of the first round. So the names that I'm going to hit you with, and I'm going to cheat, as I told Derek to pick 1, and I'm picking 3, but I'm going to go quick. The first one is Sam O'Reilly from my region. I just think he had a really good second half, a really good playoffs for London. Is similar to Cole Beaudoin in the sense that he's a really heavy, very mature player who plays that power forward sort of style, is versatile in terms of the different positions that he can play at forward, the different roles that he can play. And I think, obviously, playing in London, teams have a lot of respect and trust in Dale Hunter and the way that he develops players, the way that he develops these types of forwards in particular. And I think I could see a team really falling in love with O'Reilly and taking him in the first. And the other 2 guys I'm going to just lump together, and that's Adam Kleber and Will Skahan. I just think that you've got 2 really big defenders who have decent mobility, who Skahan in particular plays that real throwback style that you don't see a lot in terms of, the punishing physicality anymore. And I think that there's a good chance that one or even both of those guys could go in the first, because teams are looking for these types of guys to really help anchor their second pairing and help them on the PK and help them be better in the playoffs.
Yeah, and for my guy, I picked actually someone out of your neck of the woods, Dean Letourneau out of St. Andrews College. And I think he's someone that a team is going to probably reach for. I think it's fair to say that picking him in the first round would be a reach, but I could understand why a team would do it. Because you've got a guy who's a center, who's, I think he measured at 6'7" and has a ridiculous wingspan. That's, I think, even bigger than that. But he's also a really, really high-end athlete. And this year, some of the hockey skills were very hit or miss. He showed some flashes with his skating ability, some flashes with his hands and his shot and his playmaking. But there were times where he really struggled to put it all together, which is obviously not great. But you also have a guy who's still very much growing into his body. You can tell he's got issues with his coordination and his balance because he probably had a really big growth spurt not that long ago and he hasn't fully adjusted to it yet. But what we're seeing more and more in hockey as a whole, not just in the NHL, but throughout the whole hockey world, is focus on development, on skills training, having a specific coach for puck skills, having a specific coach for skating, having nutritionists and dietitians and all this different stuff to help players maximize their potential. And with Letourneau, the potential is really high. I mean, this is a guy who could be a middle six center who can play both ends of the ice and just has that amazing size that's always going to be an advantage for him. You get some guys who are, maybe big in their league at 6'2", and then they're not so big when they get to the NHL level. Letourneau is going to be big all the time. He's always going to have that advantage over other players. So if you can work with him to develop up some of the hockey skills, if you trust in his natural athleticism to kind of win the day and he becomes like a really, really solid, well-conditioned player who can log a lot of minutes at the NHL level and he works on his balance and his agility, I think there's just a lot there to work with in a way that you don't see with a lot of other prospects. And I wouldn't be surprised to see a team that maybe has 2 picks in the first round or, took a lot of high picks in the last few years who views him as kind of like a long-term project that's worth taking on, because the best case scenario with Letourneau is better than a lot of the best case scenarios for a lot of other players in that kind of range.
And I think something that's worth noting about Letourneau is, about any first round pick, is that if you choose a player in the first round and, they don't end up working out, you can take the route of, we're not going to sign this guy. We're going to take that comp pick. Right. And that's the difference between taking Dean Letourneau at 32 versus taking him at 33. 32, look, that's a big swing with him in that first round, right? The upside is extremely high. The bust potential is extremely high as well. So if he goes to college, things don't work out, you don't want to sign him like, say, the Flyers did with Jay O'Brien, who now they've got a comp pick this year for O'Brien. Similar sort of situation of drafting a player out of prep, out of high school, whatever you want to call it. If Letourneau doesn't work out, you can cut your ties and you can take that comp pick and you can try to recruit an asset for that player, right? But if you take Dean Letourneau and you really roll that dice and you take him at 33, you really have to commit to that development, right? You've got to make sure that, he's going to be an NHL player. So I kind of see Letourneau as, he's either going to be a first rounder, or I see teams kind of being scared off by him and sort of taking him in that like mid to late second round where he falls a little bit. I think it's going to be one of those two things. I don't necessarily know if I see Letourneau being, like the 34th or 35th overall pick. I think if a team likes him enough, they're going to take him early enough, but I could be wrong on that. Okay. So next we're going to talk about a player that we think gets drafted lower than we have them ranked. So I'll let Derek go first on this one.
Yeah, so that would be, for me, Yegor Surin out of the MHL in Russia. And we have him 30th on our list because we think that in the long run, if teams ever go or people ever go back and look at these rankings from the past, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, I think the Surin ranking that we have is going to look good. He's a guy who had a very good season over in Russia at the MHL level, scored at well over a point per game pace, had a very, very strong playoffs. And he's a guy who mixes skill with a ton of tenacity. He's a real pest. He's a real hard worker. You can see he does a really good job of getting under the skin of other players, but he's also someone who can generate offense and can be a committed defensive player. There's shades of Brad Marchand to how he plays, and that's really appealing. And, if he played this year and maybe in North America, or he just wasn't Russian at all, I think there'd be a lot more buzz about him. But just with the way things are going geopolitically over there, and, with Demidov and Salayev, there's so much more upside there that teams are going to be willing to take a little bit more of that risk. With Cernan, it's not quite as obvious. He's good, but he's not quite a truly special talent. So maybe you worry a little bit more about the risk. It's been hard for NHL teams to interview these players overseas and to get, live views on them aside from, dedicated Russian scouts. So I think Cern's going to be a guy who drops, and for obvious reasons, and there'll be understandable reasons, but I think he's going to be a guy who keeps developing very, very well over in Russia. He's going to be playing in the KHL sooner rather than later. And I think by the time he's about 22 or 23, he's going to be ready to come over to North America, if not sooner. And I think he's going to be a guy who just fights and claws and wins an NHL job and finds a way to stick around and become an impact player at the NHL level.
And the guy that I'm going to pick, I've kind of already alluded to. I mentioned it earlier in the podcast, and that's Alphonse Fry. I just worry that NHL teams are going to view him as a defender that has a murky projection, a kind of guy that maybe will struggle to find a role at the NHL level because he skates really well, but there are other components of his game that maybe, are a little bit more unrefined. So depending on how those develop, he might struggle to find that role. And I think that NHL teams might see him more as, a second round guy as opposed to a first round guy, especially as high as we have him at 19. Sorry. I think next it's important that we talk about some goalies, and we're not going to talk a ton about these goalies because there's some other stuff that we do want to cover before we say goodnight on this podcast. And our first 5 goalies in terms of our ranking are as follows, and that's Carter George at 51st, Pavel Moisevich at 66th, Mikhail Yegorov at 67, Ryerson Lenders at 78th, and then Ilya Nabokov at 85th. And those are the 5 goalies that we feel very, very confident in this class for different reasons. And I think we just kind of wanted to just briefly touch on each player. So let's play a little bit of a game here, Derek. I want you to give me, and I'm going to do the same for each goalie. I want you to give me 2 words that describe each goalie the best.
Okay.
So Carter George.
Composure and technique.
You stole mine. That's the exact 2. So I think that gives people a pretty good idea of what Carter George brings to the table because that really is what his game's all about. Okay, Pavel Moisevich. I'll go first. Raw and athleticism.
Mm-hmm. Those are good ones. I would go with toolsy and upside.
Okay, interesting.
Okay. He's a goalie that I think has kind of all the tools you want to see out of an NHL goalie, and he's still kind of learning how to best utilize them. He's a bit of a late bloomer, but he had a great season over in Russia, and I think there's going to be a lot of NHL teams who see him as someone that they can really work with and possibly develop into a future starter.
Okay, Mikhail Yegorov.
Resilience and balance. I think he's a guy who played very well in bad circumstances this year in Omaha in the USHL, and balance because he's got a very balanced toolkit. I think there's nothing really about his game that I think would be considered a weakness. I think he's good to very good at everything he does as a goalie, and I think we're going to see a lot more of him in the future because I think he's got a lot of upside too.
Yeah, I think resilience is a great word. I was actually trying to think of a word that best represented his situation this year in Omaha, and I think that's it. And I think the other one would just be athletic as well. I think much like Moisevich, he's a player that has sort of a much less refined technique compared to a guy like Carter George, but the athletic upside is probably a little bit higher just because of, that size and quickness and athleticism combination. Okay, Ryerson Leanders. I'll go first for this one just because he's in my region, so I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to say dynamic and unrefined.
I'm going to use a similar word to dynamic. I was going to say dramatic. because he's just kind of one of those dramatic kind of goalies, like a Jonathan Quick, where, he might let in some goals that he should have saved, but he'll also make the 10 bell save that ends up in the highlight reel forever, because that's just kind of how he plays. And opportunity, I want to say, was as another word, because he's in a competition to get starts the next couple of years. If he was going to be a clear starter, I think he'd be probably higher on this list, but he's going to be someone that is going to have to really earn his minutes.
Yeah, for those unfamiliar, what Derek is alluding to is the fact that the the Brampton Steelheads now also have Jack Ivankovic, who is one of the top net minders for the 2025 draft next year, and they're going to be in direct competition for playing time next year. So unless he moves or they move Ivankovic, it's going to be interesting to see how that dynamic plays out and whether it affects his development or not. And the last one is Ilya Nabokov.
Yeah, my words would be resume and outlier, because he's got a great resume. I mean, he led his team to a KHL championship this year as a 21-year-old, which is pretty incredible. But, he's not a very big goalie. He's very small, smaller than we usually see in the NHL. So the question becomes, is he capable of being an outlier and going against the grain and succeeding in the NHL as a guy who's like a UC Saros-sized type netminder?
Yeah, it's funny. I was actually going to use the word anomaly, and it's sort of the same idea, right? Like, we're looking at a smaller goaltender who has had a phenomenal season, a phenomenal second half, winning a KHL championship and a playoff MVP, and you just don't see that very often. And I think it's a shoo-in that he gets drafted. It's just a matter of how high. Okay, we're going to talk about a couple of our favorite sleepers within our top 100. So not guys outside of the top 100, guys that are inside of our top 100 that we really like, maybe more than the consensus. I'll let Derek go first with this one. Derek, you going first for this one?
Oh, sorry, I had myself muted there for a second. My bad. So my two guys are Nate Miskey and Simon Zether. Nate Miskey is a defenseman with the Victoria Royals in the WHL, and he's interesting because he was passed over last year. I watched him. There were times where I thought about ranking him, and I just ended up, not doing it, which I regret now, because he took a huge step forward this season and proved me and really all NHL teams wrong by, they didn't draft him, and now he's looking like a really, really impressive prospect. I mean, he's 6'3" or 6'2", right shot defenseman who's pretty solid with the puck. I think he sees the ice very well. His skating is a work in progress, but he did make progress this year, and he put up a lot of points and really emerged as a top four defenseman at the WHL level. And like we said before, you want to find guys who are improving, who are moving their development in the right direction. And I think he's going to be someone who draws a lot of interest from NHL teams, because he's a defenseman with size who can make an impact at both ends of the ice. And the other one is Simon Zether, who I think is one of the bigger wild cards in this draft. At the start of the year, he was playing down in the Swedish junior level and was lighting it up, well over a point per game player, and was really dominating a lot of his games. Like, he was generating a ton of offensive chances as a center with size and mobility and puck skill, who could play a 200-foot game and leave an impact on a lot of different areas. Unfortunately for him, he actually played so well that he got called up to the SHL level and then got stuck in a fourth line role. And he didn't look bad as a fourth liner at the SHL level. He actually helped his team make it all the way to the SHL finals as a regular on their roster. But you just didn't see the same level of dominance or skill that you saw at the junior level. So he's someone that I think I want to believe that he's more of the guy we saw in the first half of the season than the one we saw in the second half of the season. I think he's a guy who, even though he didn't score a lot in the SHL this year, I mean, he barely scored at all, I think he's got more upside offensively than I think a lot of people realize. Brock? Brock, are you there?
Oh yeah, sorry, I was muted too. Jeez, we're getting sloppy here towards the end of this podcast.
Yeah, we'll have to
Apologies to
let
everybody
Mark
listening.
know to edit this.
Yeah. So Mark, edit some of this, please.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my two guys, I think, are two very similar players, and that's AJ Spellacy and Jack Pridham. I think they're both excellent athletes, two of the better skaters, at least in terms of linear explosiveness in this entire draft class. Spellacy, very aggressive two-way player. Pridham still kind of learning how to use all of his tools to be a consistent player because he's playing in the BCHL. So he's a little bit more raw, but I think they have probably similar upsides. Just two guys that I think have a long runway to improve based on their athletic attributes. Okay, so now let's look at our favorite sleepers outside of our top 100. And we're just going to choose one for this one. And I'm going to go with Matthew Van Blaricom of the Humboldt Broncos out of the SJHL. This is somebody that really caught my eye at the World Junior A Challenge, where I thought he was one of the better forwards at the event. And for those who aren't familiar with that event, it's an event played around a holiday time that brings together some of the hockey powerhouses. And some teams use it as a way to get a look at players they, wouldn't necessarily normally look at for certain things. Others bring over really good rosters. Like Sweden brings over some of their better U18 players. The US brings basically a USHL all-star team. Canada's, depending on, who's available out of Canada West, Canada East. Sometimes there's a lot of talent there as well. And Van Blaricom played on Canada West, who didn't have a tremendous tournament, but he did individually. And for those that don't know me very well, I'm a sucker for the throwback power forwards. You're talking to a guy that owns a Rafi Torres, Todd McFarlane, Edmonton Oilers jersey. So this is a guy that I think plays that similar kind of style. He's chaos on the ice. He can score goals, but he also can change the balance of a shift with a big hit. He was one of the higher scoring players in the SJHL. He was one of the highest scoring players of the World Junior A Challenge. And I think that he's just a really interesting mid-round swing as somebody that, we don't really know how everything's going to translate to a higher level playing out of the SJHL, but I'd be willing to take that bet in the middle rounds.
One sec, Brock. Oh, sorry. So 3, 2, 1. My guy is not someone from my region, but he's someone that I didn't start watching until very late in the year. His name is Erik Wallenius out of Finland. And man, talk about a good trajectory. This is a guy who started the year in Finland's U18 level, worked his way up to the U20 level, and then actually got a call up to play a game in the Liga. And I didn't think he looked out of place in the Liga at all. He is kind of a monster on skates. He's like a grizzly bear on skates. He's about 6'5", seems pretty well north of 200 pounds right now, but he also moves pretty well. He handles the puck pretty well. And there's just this very enticing rawness to his game. He reminds me a little bit of some guys who we've seen get picked in recent years, in Liam Bixell, who was picked in the first round by the Dallas Stars, and Alexander Nikishin, who was a third-round pick of the Carolina Hurricanes, but has emerged as one of the best defense prospects in the world. Two very, very good players who can overpower their competition, but it will also have some genuine skill to their games and are growing more skill as we speak. And I think Wallenius is maybe like a dollar store version of those two kind of guys. I don't think he's going to be at that same kind of level, but I think he's someone that has very appealing NHL tools, who's just sort of starting to really learn how to use all of them. But I think with the situation that he's in over in Europe, he's going to get more time to play over there and to play at a pro level. probably consistently pretty soon. I think he's going to be someone that makes the NHL at, 24 or 25 and really starts to blow people away. And then everyone goes, wow, where did this guy come from?
All right. So to end things off, we have just a couple of questions from social media. We have 3, in fact. So we're just going to kind of go through those and then we will end this podcast. So the first question that we received was, how many first round graded players do we feel there are? So this is an interesting question. I feel like it does provide an opportunity for a little bit of context here. So yes, there are only 32 selections in the first round, but some people might believe while there's 32 selections, there might only be 20 players that they would give a first round grade in a normal year. In other years, if you feel that the depth of a draft is fantastic, you might say there might be 40 players who would get a first round grade. So there's a lot of depth. Derek, where are you on this draft class as a whole? How many players roughly would you say deserve a first round grade?
I would say less this year than usual. Overall, I do like this year. I think there's a lot of guys that I really like as second rounders. Cole Hudson was one of the ones I mentioned earlier where I think he just makes a ton of sense as a second round pick. But for first round talents, I'd say maybe 34, 35 guys. I'm just looking at our list here and some names that are just on the outside as, Teddy Stiga, Andrew Basha, Igor Chernyshov. There's a few guys that I think you could make that argument that, could be first round graded talents, but not that many outside of the 32. I think it kind of pretty neatly cuts off around the 32 mark, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would agree. I like the depth of this draft class, but I might even cut it off even earlier. I might kind of have it at like that 25, 26 range. I feel like there's a bit of a drop off after that. In terms of, yes, there are a lot of guys within that glut who could be first rounders, but in a normal year, I don't know if they would be. So I like the depth. I don't know if I like the high end depth of this class quite as much. The next question is about Kevin He, who I know you actually like a fair amount, Derek. Where does Kevin He get drafted?
I mean, that's a good question. I would say somewhere probably in the third round. He's certainly not a perfect player, not a well-rounded player, but he is a very, very fast skater, and he's shown a knack for being able to score in odd man situations, whether it's 2-on-1, breakaway, that sort of thing. And I think when you have a player who's got some tools that are high end, or a single tool that's very high end in the case of He's skating and speed, I think that's appealing for teams because some guys, they kind of blend into the scenery a little bit. Once you start getting into the third or fourth round, there's guys who are good at some things or just kind of average overall, where I think teams are going to be looking for players that have a real standout trait. Maybe you've got a prospect pool with some heavier, stronger forwards, and you don't have a speed element in your system. I could see a team being in that situation and thinking to themselves, we need to find a forward who brings a speed element to our team, who could maybe be a fast energy guy or a speedy penalty killer. And I think with he just projects well in that area. I think his strongest tools are going to be the strongest tools for moving forward. And I think that's going to be appealing for at least one NHL team.
I think he's one of those guys that has a really vast range for the draft this year. Honestly, I would put it at somewhere between like the 60th pick and the 150th pick. Like, I think that it's a really wide range for him. And that's because I think teams are going to have some question marks as to the IQ and what the overall upside is. And how well he's able to use his skating ability at the next level, just because playing in Niagara, it was kind of tough on some nights to see, what the vision, what the playmaking ability is like, how well he really thinks the game. There are a lot of interesting attributes, like you said, but I could see teams kind of being scared off by that. On the flip side, I could see teams really liking his competitiveness and his skating ability and his goal scoring ability and thinking that this is a guy that could play, a solid middle six role for us. So I would put that range, and I know that sounds ridiculous, like 60 to 150, but I really could see him going anywhere from like the second to the fifth round. And the last question that we have is one that I'm going to leave for you, Derek, because I know you're very familiar with him, and I know that your opinion on him was one of the reasons that we did sort of leave him out of the first round. And the question is, why no Tarek Parasak in the first round?
Yeah, and let me be clear, I do like Parasak overall. I don't want to give the impression that I don't, because there's a lot to like about him, and he really impressed me at different points this season for different reasons. But I think it's important to recognize that while most of the players who produce at a really high level in junior go on to become productive NHLers, not all of them do. It's very important to understand the context behind the production that a player has or doesn't have. And with Parasak, he scored a ton of points this year, and that might lead people to think that this is a guy who should be a surefire first rounder. But when you watch him really closely, it does raise some doubts. He played on a very good, very deep team, a team that leaned offense and had some very good offensive pieces, that played in a division that had some very, very bad defensive teams. So there were times where Parasak would have 3 or 4 or 5 points in a game without really doing a lot that was high end. He's a guy who's got some good tools. I think he's got a good hockey mind. I think he works very hard. He's pretty good as a puck handler, pretty good as a playmaker, pretty solid off-puck player. But I don't think he's going to be the type of offensive generator that his numbers would suggest. And I also don't think that he has the pure physical tools to be a major defensive forward at the NHL level. Usually you need a lot of size and strength, or really high-end skating ability, or a good blend of the two. Whereas Parasak, he's kind of average sized. He's not overly athletic. And I'd say his skating is average at best, maybe below average. And yeah, I just worry about what his game is going to look like at the NHL level. In a best case scenario, maybe he becomes an outlier and becomes a Joe Pavelski type of player, where he's just so smart and so consistent that he finds his way around pucks all the time, and he really maximizes every puck touch he gets. And that's where he provides value at the NHL level as like a great net front guy or a really good connector in the offensive zone. But, there aren't a lot of Joe Pavelskis out there. The guys that look like Parasak and play like Parasak, high point totals or not, usually don't become very, very successful NHLers. So I just find that there's a lot of risk with him, and too much risk that I wouldn't feel comfortable taking him in the first round.
All right. Well, that brings an end to our podcast. We want to thank everybody for listening. And if you loved what you heard, and if you are not already a subscriber, please head over to McKeensHockey.com, pick up our draft guide for 2024, and subscribe. Lots of great content to come before the draft. If you ever have any questions, please reach out to Derek and I on social media. I'm at Brock Otten, and Derek, you are at
Derek_N_NHL.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening.